19 years. That's how long I spent making sure an entire factory kept running without anyone noticing the problems I solved every single day. Then one HR meeting changed everything. They handed me a 2% raise, told me that leadership creates more value, and expected me to smile and get back to work. So I quietly placed my resignation letter on the table and walked away. Less than an hour later, the production lines began slowing down. Millions of dollars were suddenly at risk, and the same people who had just told me I was replaceable started calling my phone non-stop. What happened next completely changed how that company viewed experience, loyalty, and the true cost of undervaluing the people who actually keep a business alive. My name is Ethan Brooks. I'm 46 years old, and for the past 19 years, I've worked in industrial automation. I don't have an MBA, a business degree, or a polished resume filled with executive buzzwords. What I do have is nearly 2 decades of solving problems that most people never even realize exist. For 19 years, every production line at North River Manufacturing depended on systems I either designed, rebuilt, or quietly repaired before anyone noticed something was wrong. The strange thing about doing your job well is that people eventually assume everything just works. Until it doesn't. The meeting started at 8:30 on a Tuesday morning. My manager, Melissa Grant, had asked me to stop by conference room B after I finished checking a firmware update on one of our robotic packaging cells. I figured it would be another discussion about next quarter's maintenance budget, or maybe another request to train the newest engineer. Instead, HR was already waiting. Daniel Harper from Human Resources sat beside Melissa with a thin folder placed perfectly in front of him. Every sheet inside looked carefully aligned, almost as if neat paperwork somehow made unpleasant conversations easier. "Good morning, Ethan," Daniel said politely. I nodded. "Morning." Melissa smiled, though it looked forced. "Have a seat." The room was unusually quiet. Outside the glass walls, engineers hurried between departments carrying laptops and maintenance kits. Forklifts moved pallets across the warehouse floor while automated conveyors hummed like they always had. Inside, nobody spoke for almost 10 seconds. Daniel finally slid a document toward me. "We've completed the annual compensation review." I looked down. Senior Automation Systems Engineer. Years of service, 19. Performance rating, outstanding. Salary adjustment, 4%. That was it. No promotion. No retention bonus. No recognition of the projects that had saved the company millions over the last decade. Just 4%. I read the page twice before looking back up. "I rebuilt 3 production lines this year," I said calmly. Daniel nodded. "And we appreciate those contributions." "I reduced machine downtime by 42%. "Correct." "The predictive monitoring platform I wrote prevented 2 major equipment failures." Melissa smiled again. "It certainly helped." "So?" I tapped the paper. "This is how we're valuing that?" Daniel folded his hands. "Compensation follows company guidelines and current market benchmarks." I'd heard those words before. They sounded professional. They also meant absolutely nothing. I leaned back in my chair. "What does Ryan make?" Silence. Melissa looked toward Daniel. Daniel cleared his throat. "I'm afraid I can't discuss another employee's salary." I didn't ask for the exact number. Another pause. I asked what someone with 8 months here is worth. Ryan Mitchell had joined the company less than a year earlier. His title was Director of Manufacturing Innovation. Nice title. Expensive title. He spent most of his time preparing presentations for executive meetings, colorful charts, growth forecasts, efficiency roadmaps. He rarely stepped onto the factory floor. The first time he visited Production Hall 3, he asked why emergency stop buttons were painted red. I honestly thought he was joking. He wasn't. Daniel chose his words carefully. Ryan's position operates under a different compensation structure. Meaning, leadership roles command higher market salaries. I smiled. Not because I found anything funny, because I'd finally stopped being surprised. So the person making PowerPoint presentations earns significantly more than the person keeping 24 production lines operating? Melissa jumped in. "It's not that simple." "No?" She hesitated. "You each provide value in different ways." Different ways. That phrase echoed in my head. My father had worked as an electrician for 35 years. He used to tell me something when I was young. The people who actually fix problems rarely get applause. They only get blamed when something breaks. Back then I didn't fully understand. Now I did. Daniel continued. We benchmark executive positions against national compensation surveys. And engineers? The same. Interesting. I opened my notebook. Inside wasn't just maintenance records. It contained every major automation project I'd completed over the past 19 years. Every software migration. Every emergency repair. Every production upgrade. Every weekend spent inside this building, while everyone else was home with their families. Sometimes I wondered why I kept writing everything down. Now I knew. I turned a few pages. In 2015, the primary conveyor control network failed during peak production. Melissa nodded. I remember. I restored operations in 4 hours. Another page. 2018. Servo synchronization failure. Another. 2020. Electrical fire damaged cell 7. Another. 2022. Supply chain redesign. Another. Last November. I looked directly at Melissa. Remember when the packaging robots kept randomly stopping every 18 minutes? She nodded immediately. It almost delayed the Baxter contract. It would have. I closed the notebook. The manufacturer wanted to replace 7 robot controllers. Daniel listened quietly. I discovered a timing issue inside a firmware update. Melissa finished my sentence. You fixed it overnight. I fixed it in 6 hours. Replacing the controllers would have cost nearly $800,000. My solution cost nothing. Not because the repair was easy, because I knew exactly where to look. 19 years teaches you things manuals never mention. Every strange vibration. Every undocumented software patch. Every temporary workaround someone forgot to remove 8 years earlier. Factories develop personalities. You only learn them by living with them. Daniel pushed the salary document slightly closer. We truly value your experience. I stared at him. No. He blinked. You value having my experience. There's a difference. The room became quiet again. I realized something during those few seconds. Nobody was arguing with me. Nobody claimed I was wrong. Nobody disputed the value I'd created. They simply believed they could continue paying less because I'd always stayed. That realization hurt more than the raise itself. I reached into my backpack. Melissa watched carefully. Daniel stopped talking. I removed a single envelope. Already sealed. Already signed. I placed it on top of the compensation letter. Daniel looked confused. Then he read the first line. His expression changed immediately. Ethan. My resignation. Effective immediately. Melissa's face lost color. I wasn't expecting this. I know. We can discuss alternatives. I've been discussing alternatives in my own head for 3 years. Daniel picked up the letter. This feels impulsive. I almost laughed. Impulsive? I'd spent 6 months updating my certifications. 4 months interviewing after work. 3 months comparing offers. 2 weeks negotiating a contract. Nothing about this was impulsive. I stood up and picked up my notebook. My replacement will find detailed documentation on every production line. Melissa looked relieved. Then I added, everything except the undocumented fixes. Her expression changed again. Because we all knew something uncomfortable. Every factory has systems that no documentation fully explains. Not because anyone hides information. Because reality changes faster than paperwork ever can. I walked toward the door. Ethan. I stopped. Melissa's voice sounded almost desperate. Can we at least talk this through? I looked back. I've spent 19 years making sure this factory never stopped. I paused. Now it's someone else's turn. I opened the conference room door. Behind me, nobody said another word. At that moment, none of us realized that within the next 40 minutes, the smallest software service inside the entire factory would begin failing. And it would expose just how much of North River's operation depended on knowledge that had never existed in any manual. I had barely finished loading the last box into my car when my phone vibrated. Then it vibrated again. And again. 3 missed calls. 2 emails. for Microsoft Teams notifications. I didn't open any of them. At exactly 9:14 a.m., my company account was automatically disabled. My building access card stopped working a minute later, just as company policy required. 19 years of employment officially ended in less than 5 minutes. I sat in my car for a moment, watching employees walk across the parking lot carrying coffee cups and laptops. Most of them had no idea anything unusual had happened. To them, it was just another Tuesday. I started the engine and drove home. Halfway there, my personal phone rang. Melissa. I let it go to voicemail. Then Daniel called. Ignored. 5 minutes later, the plant director called. Ignored. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I had 11 missed calls. That was unusual. Normally, after someone resigned, the company moved on quickly. Nobody called that many times unless something had gone very wrong. I made coffee instead. Old habit. Whenever a complicated problem appeared, coffee came first. By the time I sat down in my kitchen, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Noah Carter, one of the automation engineers I'd mentored for nearly 4 years. Noah, can you call me? Something's happening with line 4. I stared at the message for several seconds. Noah wasn't dramatic. If he said something was wrong, it usually was. Still, I no longer worked there. I put the phone face down. What happened next was something I only learned later from Noah and several other engineers. At 9:42 a.m., production line 4 suddenly slowed by almost 30%. Nothing actually failed. No alarms. No emergency shutdown. No flashing warning lights. The robotic arms simply started hesitating between movements. Half a second, then another, then another. On paper, the delay looked insignificant. In reality, every packaging robot depended on the timing of the previous one. Half a second became 2. 2 became 7. Within 20 minutes, boxes started piling up faster than conveyors could move them. Operators began clearing jams manually. Sensors detected unexpected product spacing. Automatic rejects increased. By 10:05, every downstream production cell was running behind schedule. The strange part? Every diagnostic screen showed green. No hardware faults. No communication errors. No failed motors. Everything looked perfectly healthy. Except production output had dropped by nearly 40%. Noah checked the PLC logs. Nothing. He reviewed the network switches. Normal. Servo drives? Normal. Industrial Ethernet traffic? Perfect. Every number looked exactly the way it should. Yet the factory was quietly falling apart. Around 10:20, Ryan Mitchell finally walked onto the production floor. According to Noah, he arrived carrying a tablet instead of safety gloves. He looked around at pallets beginning to accumulate beside the conveyor system. What's happening? Ryan asked. We're trying to figure that out, Noah replied without looking away from his laptop. Can we restart the line? Noah sighed. If we restart without understanding the problem, we could lose synchronization across the packaging cells. Ryan frowned. But restarting fixes computers. One of the maintenance technicians actually looked up from the control cabinet. Nobody answered. Ryan continued. So, why don't we just reboot everything? Noah later admitted it took every ounce of self-control not to laugh. Industrial automation wasn't like rebooting a laptop. A production line had over 200 interconnected devices. Robots, vision systems, servo controllers, safety relays, barcode readers, conveyor PLCs. Restarting them in the wrong order could create an even larger failure. Unfortunately, Ryan didn't understand that. He wasn't stupid. He simply lacked experience. Experience no presentation could replace. At 10:37, Melissa arrived. She immediately recognized something unusual. People weren't panicking. They were confused. Confusion is often worse. When engineers panic, they usually know what's broken. When they're confused, they don't even know where to begin. She walked straight to Noah. What have you found? He shook his head. Nothing. What do you mean nothing? Everything checks out. But production keeps slowing. Exactly. Melissa crossed her arms. Call Ethan. Noah hesitated. He resigned. I know. His access is disabled. I know. So, Melissa looked around the room. Every engineer had opened different diagnostics. Every maintenance technician was checking hardware. Everyone was working. Nobody was finding anything. Finally, she said quietly, "Just call him." At 11:06 a.m., my phone rang again. This time it was Noah. I answered. "Hey." His voice sounded exhausted. "Ethan, I know you don't work here anymore." "That's correct. We've got a strange timing issue." I stayed silent. He continued. "No alarms. No hardware failures. No network errors. Everything looks normal. Production delay. Normal diagnostics. No obvious cause." I already had a theory, but I didn't interrupt him. "We've been tracing it for almost 2 hours. Did you check the synchronization service?" Silence. "What synchronization service?" I closed my eyes. Of course, the service wasn't documented. It couldn't be. I had written it myself 12 years earlier after discovering that 2 different robot manufacturers process timestamps differently. The software quietly corrected those differences every few milliseconds. It had run continuously for over a decade. Most people forgot it even existed, because it never caused problems. Until it stopped. "Ethan." Noah sounded nervous now. "I've never heard of that service." "I know. Where is it?" "I don't work there anymore." Another long silence. Finally he asked, "Can you at least tell me where to look?" I took a slow sip of coffee. 19 years ago, I promised myself I'd never hold a company hostage with knowledge. I documented everything that belonged to North River. But what you're asking about isn't documentation. It was experience. Experience earned from thousands of nights spent inside that factory while everyone else slept. Experience that couldn't be transferred during a 2-week notice period, because there hadn't been one. Noah didn't argue. I understand. I appreciated that. He wasn't trying to guilt me. He simply wanted to keep the factory running. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "So am I." When the call ended, I sat staring out the kitchen window. For the first time that morning, I realized something. The problem wasn't that the company had lost an engineer. The problem was that they had spent years believing one engineer could never be indispensable. Now they were beginning to discover the difference between replacing a position and replacing 19 years of accumulated knowledge. I didn't hear from anyone for the rest of the afternoon. That surprised me. If the issue had been minor, they wouldn't need me anymore. If the issue had become serious, I expected more phone calls. Instead, there was silence. The next morning, I woke up at 6 like I had every weekday for nearly 20 years. Old habits don't disappear overnight. I made breakfast, opened my laptop, and completed the online onboarding modules for my new employer, Sterling Automation Solutions. By 10 o'clock, my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Noah. It was Melissa. I answered. "Good morning." There was a long pause before she spoke. "Ethan." She sounded exhausted. "I need to ask you something." "I'm listening." "Would you be willing to come in as an independent consultant?" I smiled to myself. Not because I enjoyed hearing her struggle. Because less than 24 hours earlier, the company had told me exactly how much my work was worth. Now they wanted to buy the same expertise by the hour. I already accepted another position. "I know. We're prepared to pay consulting rates." "What happened?" Another pause. Then she answered honestly. "We still haven't solved it." That caught my attention. The synchronization issue should have been fixable once someone understood where to look. Unless, who has been working on it? Everyone. She wasn't exaggerating. Later I learned the company had assembled nearly every technical employee into one emergency response team. Automation engineers, controls specialists, IT engineers, maintenance supervisors, electrical technicians. Even 2 outside consultants had joined remotely. Together they had more than 80 years of combined experience. Yet they couldn't solve one problem. Not because they lacked intelligence. Because they lacked context. Knowledge doesn't only exist in documentation. Sometimes it exists in hundreds of tiny observations collected over thousands of ordinary workdays. The sound a motor makes before a bearing starts failing. A sensor that occasionally reports incorrect values during cold mornings. A controller that behaves differently after certain firmware updates. None of those things appear in manuals. They live inside the people who spend years paying attention. Melissa continued. We've already lost almost an entire day's production. Customers. They're starting to ask questions. And Ryan. She sighed. He's in executive meetings. That answer told me everything. The people making decisions were no longer standing beside the machines. They were standing in conference rooms. I appreciate the offer, I said carefully, but I think it's better if your team solves this. Ethan. If I come back now, nothing changes. She didn't argue, because she knew I was right. The company had reached this point through years of decisions, not one bad morning. Before hanging up, she quietly said, I'm sorry. It sounded genuine. So am I. 3 days later, Noah invited me to lunch. We met at a small diner about 15 minutes away from the factory. He looked like he hadn't slept much. You look terrible, I said. He laughed. I feel worse. The waitress poured coffee before either of us ordered. So I asked, how bad was it? He leaned back. Worse than anyone expected. The synchronization service had finally been identified late Tuesday evening. Not because someone found documentation. Because one retired contractor remembered hearing me mention it during an upgrade almost 10 years earlier. It took another 6 hours to understand how it worked. Then another 4 hours to safely restore it without creating new timing conflicts. Total production disruption. 31 hours. Lost production. Late shipments. Contract penalties. Emergency consulting fees. Weekend overtime. Replacement parts that turned out not to be necessary. The final estimate exceeded $2 million. All because of software that occupied less than 50 megabytes on one industrial computer. It wasn't even complicated, Noah admitted. We just didn't know it existed. I nodded. That's usually how expensive mistakes happen. He stirred his coffee for a moment. Can I ask you something? Sure. Were you angry? I thought about that question longer than he probably expected. No. Really? I was disappointed. There's a difference. When you're angry, you want someone to suffer. When you're disappointed, you simply stop believing things will change. He looked down at his cup. I think a lot of people finally understand what you actually did around there. I smiled. I hope they understand something bigger. Like what? Maintenance isn't about fixing machines. It's about preventing people from noticing they almost failed. Most successful engineers spend their careers making disasters invisible. Ironically, that makes their value difficult to measure. Executives celebrate new production records. Sales teams celebrate contracts. Marketing celebrates growth. Nobody celebrates the engineer who quietly prevented 50 problems that never happened. Because nothing happened. Success becomes invisible until failure makes it obvious. A week later, I started my new job. The difference became clear before lunch on the first day. My new manager, Laura Bennett, met me at the entrance. Instead of taking me directly to HR, she walked me through the production floor. I want you to see how we work. Every engineer introduced themselves. Every technician stopped long enough to shake hands. Nobody seemed rushed. Nobody seemed afraid to admit they didn't know something. Then Laura brought me into a conference room. On the wall hung a large diagram titled, Critical Knowledge Map. Every production system listed not only documentation, but also multiple engineers trained to support it. No single person's name appeared by itself. I noticed immediately. You don't allow single points of failure. Laura smiled. Exactly. If someone leaves tomorrow, production continues. That's intentional. I found myself staring at the chart. It represented something I wanted to build for years. Not because I wanted to become replaceable. Because good engineering isn't about becoming indispensable. It's about making the organization stronger than any individual. Laura noticed where I was looking. We hired you because of your experience. She paused. But our goal isn't to keep that experience inside your head. It's to spread it across the company. For the first time in a very long time, I felt respected. Not because of my salary, although it was significantly higher. Not because of my title, although it reflected my experience. But because someone finally understood what my real job had always been. I wasn't hired simply to solve difficult problems. I was hired to make sure other people could solve them too. That was the difference between a company that depended on heroes and a company that built lasting systems. And that lesson would become even more important 6 months later, when someone from North River unexpectedly walked into my new office with an offer none of us had anticipated. 6 months passed faster than I expected. At Sterling Automation Solutions, my days were busy, but they felt different. Instead of spending every week putting out fires, we focused on preventing them. Every major system had documentation that people actually used. Every critical process had at least 3 engineers capable of supporting it. Every new feature was reviewed by someone who hadn't written the code. At first, it felt almost unnecessary. After years of being the person everyone depended on, sharing knowledge didn't come naturally. Laura noticed that. One afternoon she stopped by my office. "How's the documentation project coming?" I pointed toward the growing stack of binders and diagrams. "Almost finished." She flipped through one of them. "This is excellent. I've always documented things." She smiled. "I know. Then why does this feel different?" She looked at me for a moment before answering. "Because this time someone is actually asking you to do it." That sentence stayed with me. At North River, documentation had always been something squeezed into evenings after emergencies. Here it was considered part of engineering. Not extra work. Real work. 3 weeks later, Laura forwarded me an email. Subject: Request for external consulting support. The sender surprised me. Melissa Grant. She had recently become operations director after several changes inside North River's leadership team. The email was straightforward. "Ethan, we've spent the last several months rebuilding our automation department. We've changed reporting structures, expanded technical leadership, and invested heavily in documentation. We'd like to invite you to review our new processes as an independent consultant. We aren't asking you to return. We're asking you to tell us what we're still doing wrong." I read it twice, then a third time. There was no emotional appeal. No promises. No attempt to convince me I'd made a mistake. Just honesty. Laura leaned against my office door. "What do you think?" "I haven't decided." "If you go," she said, "go because you want to help people. Not because you owe the company anything." That made the decision easier. I accepted. Walking back into North River after 6 months felt strange. The lobby looked the same. The production floor sounded the same. The smell of machine oil and warm electric motors hadn't changed. But the people had. Noah greeted me with a grin. "Good to see you." "You too. You'll notice a few things." He wasn't exaggerating. The first thing I saw was a large screen mounted near the engineering office. It displayed every production system. Under each one were multiple names. Primary engineer. Secondary engineer. Backup engineer. Nobody owned a system alone anymore. Exactly as it should be. Melissa met me in conference room B. The same room where I'd resigned. "This room looks familiar," I said. She laughed. "I was hoping you wouldn't mention that." We both smiled. There wasn't any awkwardness anymore. Only perspective. "I owe you an apology," she said. "You don't owe me anything." "I do." She folded her hands on the table. "I thought experience could be replaced with enough hiring. I was wrong." I appreciated that she didn't blame Ryan. Or HR. Or corporate policy. She accepted responsibility. That's rare. For the next 2 days, I reviewed nearly every automation process in the factory. Some improvements impressed me. Knowledge-sharing meetings happened every Friday. Junior engineers rotated through different production lines. Major software changes required peer reviews. Every undocumented workaround had become an official engineering project. There were still problems, of course. Every factory has them. But the culture had changed. Instead of asking, "Who knows this?" people now ask, "How do we make sure everyone knows this?" That single difference would save them countless problems in the future. On my final afternoon, Melissa invited me to a meeting with the executive team. Most of the faces were new. Ryan was gone. Daniel from HR had left months earlier. The new CEO introduced himself simply as David Collins. No impressive speech. No corporate slogans. He got straight to the point. We made a very expensive mistake. I nodded. You did. He didn't argue. Our board asked one question after reviewing everything. What was it? How could one resignation create millions of dollars in losses? I answered without thinking. It didn't. The room became quiet. The resignation only exposed a problem that already existed. Several executives started taking notes. You didn't lose production because one engineer left. You lost production because the company spent years concentrating critical knowledge in one place without realizing it. I walked to the whiteboard. Then I wrote 2 sentences. Knowledge is valuable. Shared knowledge is scalable. I turned back toward the room. If your business depends on one person, then your business isn't resilient. It doesn't matter whether that person is an engineer, a salesperson, or your CEO. People retire. They resign. They get sick. They move. Good companies prepare for that. Nobody interrupted. For nearly an hour we discussed documentation, mentoring, succession planning, and technical leadership. Not once did anyone mention salary. Ironically, compensation had never been the biggest issue. Respect had been. Salary was simply the easiest way to measure whether respect actually existed. As I walked toward the parking lot, Noah caught up with me. You know, he said, things are different now. I can see that. The younger engineers ask more questions. Good. Management actually listens. Even better. He smiled. You were right. About what? Good engineers don't become valuable because nobody else understands the system. They become valuable because they help everyone else understand it. I shook his hand. Take care of this place. We will. That evening driving home, I thought about the last 20 years of my career. Leaving North River had never been about revenge. I never wanted the factory to fail. I wanted it to realize that technical expertise isn't an expense to minimize. It's an investment to protect. Machines can be replaced. Software can be rewritten. Production lines can be rebuilt. But trust, experience, and years of practical knowledge are earned one ordinary day at a time. The biggest lesson wasn't for North River. It was for me. For years, I believed loyalty alone would eventually be rewarded. It isn't. Respect isn't measured by speeches at company meetings or plaques handed out after 20 years of service. It's measured by whether your knowledge is valued while you're still there. Today, I lead a team of engineers at Sterling. Whenever someone new joins us, I tell them the same thing on their first day. Your job isn't to become indispensable. It's to make the entire team stronger than you could ever be alone. Because companies don't succeed when one person saves the day. They succeed when no one has to. And that's the kind of legacy worth leaving behind.